Hi class, and welcome to the screencast over interactions with the environment. So we're going to look at Big Idea 2, which has to do with matter and energy, and Big Idea 4, which has to do with systems interacting with each other. And you might be wondering why I've got this DNA molecule here. We're in the ecology unit, but we're going to see that DNA plays a role as well. So let's start with talking about energy versus matter. So you might remember from Biology 1, energy flows through an ecosystem, whereas matter is cycled or recycled. So in other words, as each organism eats the organism below it, it's getting energy from that organism. And so this is an example of a food web and how energy flows through it. Now remember, all energy ultimately comes from the sun, right? So energy flows, whereas matter, like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, these guys are going to cycle through the environment. These are the cycles that you remember learning about maybe a few years ago. So remember, matter cannot be created, it cannot be destroyed. Now, as we go through this video, I forewarn you, there are many, many little tiny assignments as we go. So please leave enough space in your notebook to add these assignments as you watch this video. So the first one is, don't look at your notes from earlier in the year, but try to write down those 2 laws of thermodynamics that we learned about in the energy unit, because they do play a role for certain in this ecology unit as well. So organisms get this free energy by eating an organism below it in the food web or the food chain. And how do they use it? Well, they use it to maintain homeostasis, which we learned about in the last video, last week, maintain body temperature and metabolism. Now, what we didn't learn about was there's a unique relationship between an organism's metabolic rate and the size of that organism. So larger organisms obviously have larger body mass, and they therefore require more chemical energy in total. But what's really interesting is the energy it takes to maintain each gram of body mass inversely related to body size. So it takes more per gram for a smaller organism than it does for a larger organism. And here's an example. Each gram of a mouse requires 20 times as many calories as a gram of an elephant, even though the whole elephant uses far more calories in total, right, because it's a bigger organism. But that mouse has such a high metabolism, it needs to eat a lot more calories to maintain it per gram than the elephant does. So in general, the smaller the organism, the higher the metabolic rate. So I want you to write down in your notes what you think the consequences of this fact are as far as food intake, breathing rate, and heart rate. So compare the mouse and the elephant in these 3 respects. Now, organisms also need to use this free energy to reproduce. And what's really cool, and this has to do a lot with evolution, is different strategies have evolved in response to available energy. So in other words, some organisms actually breed and reproduce in according with the climate and the season. And here's an example. This is a type of lemur, and it is strategically linked with forest seasonality. So weaning of the little babies occurs during the wet season, and this is for all lemurs. This is because during the wet season, they have this abundance of this immature leaves, and immature leaves are really, really laden with protein. And so the mother and the new child have very good source of protein. So very, very interesting that evolution has done that, or natural selection has selected for that, right? Another example, looking at the plant world, is parsley. Parsley is biennial, meaning it comes back every 2 years. And the reason why it's every 2 years is because it requires this cold treatment. And if it doesn't get this cold treatment, its whole reproductive cycle is off. So it is intricately connected with the environment. Plants and animals are intricately connected with their environment. So let's take a look. So this is a food chain, more linear, whereas a food web is more circular, more connections being made. But what happens if there are changes in free energy in this food chain or food web? So what I want you to think about is, where would a disruption have the greatest impact? And how could or would that food chain change based on that disruption? So that's another little assignment. Okay, so climate also influences primary productivity. Now, what is primary productivity? This is simply just the amount of biomass made by producers. And remember, producers are this lowest level. There are autotrophs, there are plants, right? And climate intimately affects primary productivity. And we've got 3 good graphs to look at here. So let's spend some time looking at these. Now, these are 3 different things. So one is numbers. So this is just purely showing the numbers of organisms. This is showing biomass, how much stuff is there. Okay, so how much consumers, how much producers. And this is a really interesting one we'll get to in a second, is the energy. How much energy is available at that trophic level. So each level is called a trophic level. And so what we can see is in the grassland versus the temperate forest, so there's a different climate there, that the number of producers is far more than in the temperate forest, but the number of consumers is more in the temperate forest. Now the biomass is also affected by primary productivity. So something like the English Channel has very, very low primary productivity, whereas a coral reef, something that's very dynamic and very diverse, it gets a lot of sunshine, right? English Channel does not get a lot of sunshine, but the coral reef does, and so a lot more biomass here. So now looking at energy, what you notice is that all energy pyramids look like this, where it's heavy on the bottom and small on the top. And this is called the 10% rule. So this next level, consumer 1, actually can only harvest 10% of the available energy from the producer level. Now, why is this? I want you to think about where the other 90% is going. How come they can only harvest 10% of the lower level? Here's another example of how climate influences primary productivity. I found this in a journal. This was a research study done, and what I've done is I've deleted all of the sort of labels from it, and I want you to try to come up with the labels. So here, this graph is looking at a city, Ayuco in Chile, and this is Fray Jorge in Chile as well. And they're looking, and I'm not even going to tell you. I want you to look at it. So what are the axes telling you? It's double axes. And what I want you to try to figure out or deduce, do not look it up, okay? Deduce, what does NDVI mean? You don't have to tell me what the N and the D and the V and the I mean. Just in general, what is that showing? What is this axis showing here? And in general, what are these graphs showing? How in particular is climate affecting primary productivity in this country? Now let's talk more. We've talked a lot about these organisms and how organisms reproduce, maintain homeostasis. Now we're going to look at interactions. So hopefully this is something that looks familiar to you, this whole hierarchy of life. So we have the individual, and then same species, same time and area make up a population. Many populations make up a community, and then the ecosystem is going to start to take into consideration abiotic factors as well. The sun, the soil, the temperature, the rocks, etc., in addition to the community. And then many ecosystems, many similar ecosystems make up a biome, and then many biomes make up the entire biosphere. So all of these populations and communities are interacting with their environment, and they're interacting with both biotic factors, which are living, and they're interacting with abiotic factors, which are non-living. So again, a little small assignment, name 3 biotic and 3 abiotic factors that affect organisms in this picture. Now, math, we're going to do a little bit of math in this unit. Modeling can predict the impact of biotic and abiotic factors on a population and how that population grows. And so we can actually look at it in this very, I think, simple graph here. Here we have population size, and here we have time. Now what we're looking at in this graph is something called density dependence. So in other words, its growth rate is dependent upon how many other organisms are there. And this makes sense, right? If there are a ton of organisms in that population, there's not going to be a lot of resources. There's going to be high competition, and so this population is eventually going to level off. And this leveling off place is called its carrying capacity. Each habitat or ecosystem has a specific carrying capacity. It can only hold so many individuals in that environment. So it's going to start off really nice and great. There's not a lot of organisms. It can grow rapidly. Then it starts to begin to slow. As the number of organisms increases, they don't like that very much, and then it levels off. Now there's actually an equation that goes along with this, and it's called logistic growth. We're going to use this equation in class, but I want you to write it down and know what the initials mean. So the growth is a function of both the number of individuals and the carrying capacity. So you can see by looking at this that as the number of individuals in the population grows, the growth rate is going to slow because this number becomes closer to 0, doesn't it? Now, what do you think the exponential growth would look like? So the logistic I just showed you looks like this. I want you to tell me what you think exponential growth looks like. In addition, tell me when you think exponential growth might actually happen in an ecosystem or a population. So a little bit more about density-dependent regulation. Like I said, it's competition for resources, a lot of individuals, territoriality, predation, accumulation of waste. And basically, a population can only grow so large in its environment before it hits its carrying capacity because it's interacting with all these biotic factors, these abiotic factors. So again, I'm going to have you do a little thinking. I've talked about density dependent, where it depends on the density of the population, but now I want you to think about density independent. So tell me about some density independent factors that could regulate population size. What do you think I mean by density independent? Okay, human impact. I know we've already talked about this, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. Obviously, as human numbers have increased, our impact has been magnified. We've destroyed habitats, and in some cases, it's led to the extinction of species as well. So bring in two pictures that demonstrate humans' impact on our environment. Now I'm going to talk about that genome, right? Environmental factors influence many traits. So here are some examples. Increased UV exposure actually leads to melanin production. It leads to transcription factors going into your genome and producing that protein called melanin. So it stimulates this melanogenesis because melanin is actually important to protect you from the sun. So it's a great little feedback system your body has to make this protein when you're exposed in order to protect you. Another environmental impact is sex determination in reptiles. The environment and then temperature actually sort of predict or affect what the genome is going to be, whether it's going to be male or female. So in certain species of turtles, a cooler nest is going to have more males and a warmer nest is going to have more females, which I just find so incredibly cool. It does not have to do with chromosomes, X's and Y's. It has to do with sex determination and the climate. So adaptation to environment, like these two examples I've shown, show a flexible response to the genome. Another example I always try to bring plants in is with plants. So climate change has affected flowering time in plants. Recently, I believe we've had a sort of an earlier spring, and when you look around your neighborhood, you've been seeing flowers come about earlier in March than usual. Okay, so genetic diversity of a population also affects its dynamics. So if it is high diverse, it's going to be able to respond to changes in its environment. Little genetic diversity equals at risk, right? Because it cannot adapt, it cannot change. And I just thought this article title was so funny. So lack of sex life threatens banana crops. Because remember, we talked about in class before, bananas are asexual. We've cloned them, so they're all identical. And once a disease comes or a change in the environment comes, they all get wiped out because they don't have any genetic diversity. Likewise, not all organisms will respond the same way to a change in the environment due to genetic differences. So again, the genome is highly interactive with the environment. So for example, a couple hundred years ago, we had this bubonic plague, and obviously not every individual succumbed to the plague. So some were immune or resistant, and some were not. So they responded differently to this biotic factor which was the disease. Very interesting is that we've done some research on this, and we believe that this could explain some individuals' resistance to HIV infection. So I want you to do just a tiny little bit of research about that. And what am I talking about with bubonic plague and the HIV infection? So, talked a lot about changes in matter availability, changes in energy availability, talking about how the genome interacts with the environment, density dependent, density independent. You might be thinking, how can we remain stable with all of this change and all of these factors? Well, many things. More diversity, the better, right? And that's where humans come into play. We are really lowering the diversity of species on this planet. More producers, the more biomass, the more producers we can have, the better. Essential abiotic and biotic factors like good soil pH, good rocks, temperature, even helpful biotic factors are good, like helpful animals or plants. And finally, one thing we haven't talked about, which is keystone species. So a keystone species is a species where the effect of it is actually disproportionate to the relative abundance in the ecosystem, meaning they might not be very abundant or have a lot of biomass, but they have a huge effect on the ecosystem. And when they're removed, the ecosystem often collapses. And I sort of have a funny example for you. This is like a beetle. It's called a weevil. And it feeds on a plant called M. spicatum. And it prevents this plant from overgrowing. And so when we remove even just these tiny little beetles that you might not even see, this plant would overgrow and it would take over the ecosystem and it would ruin that ecosystem. So this would be an example of a keystone species. And I want you to come up with one other keystone species and why it is so important. So I know I threw a lot at you. There is no end of video questions, and we'll talk about all of these little assignments in class.